Hello, I'm Bríd McGrath and you're very welcome to my lecture on Cavan's elections in 1613. The lecture will be published in Breifne later this year and I hope you enjoy reading it then, but I also hope that in the meantime you enjoy listening to this recorded version of the talk. The talk is called Unconstitutional Acts, Violence, Intimidation, Vote Rigging, Fraud and Resistance, Cavan's Parliamentary Elections in 1613. Cavan was shard between 1579 and 1583, and it was first represented in Parliament in 1585, when Philip and Edmund O'Reilly sat amongst the small but growing number of Gaelic Irishmen in an Irish Parliament. Much had changed, both nationally and locally, but also in England and Scotland, between that date and 1613, when the next Irish Parliament met. The end of the 9 Years' War had seen the old Gaelic order defeated, and for the first time, Crown control extended over the entire island of Ireland. Ulster and Connacht, as the two provinces least touched by English settlement and rule, would experience the greatest change. Elizabeth, who had been prepared to come to accommodations with Gaelic chiefs, had been succeeded by her cousin, the Scottish King James Stuart, who showed utter contempt for Gaelic society and Gaelic culture, whether in Scotland or Ireland. But it was not merely Gaelic clans who were out of favour. Now all Irish were regarded with official mistrust as half-subjects, especially those who remained Catholic. Even natives from Old English stock whose loyalty had been critical to defeating O'Neill and O'Donnell were now regarded with suspicion by the state and increasingly deprived of Crown offices, including as sheriffs, paid official positions and their lands. James was a firm believer in the divine right of kings and in the development of towns as centres of administration, culture, education and trade, and as drivers of economic development. He had already experimented with planting lowland Scots in the Highlands to civilise them and had created more towns in Scotland than any other previous monarch. His attitudes and background would have a profound effect in Ireland and Irish towns, including Cavan. The systems of local government and local courts had been extended to Ulster towns, including Cavan, as early as the 1590s, and English common law was extended to the whole country by proclamation from 1605. The Crown had already been planning for a changed and increasingly anglicised Ireland, replacing native Irish, whether of Old English or Gaelic origin, with New English or at least Protestant elites, designing a vastly increased network of urban settlements in strategic locations on rivers and on sites of old religious settlements, forts, castles, garrisons and walled towns. The flight of the Earls in 1607 had provided a prime and unexpected opportunity to accelerate that process and to transform Ireland radically at every level. However, much had already changed in Cavan. The O'Reilly dynasty had been devastated by internal disputes fomented by Lord Deputy Sir John Perrot's settlement with Sir John O'Reilly and by the 9 Years' War. An informal settlement with Old Englishmen from the Pale had already begun, including Captains Garrett Fleming, Walter Talbot and Richard Tyrrell. Just to say a couple of words about them. Fleming of Cabra, who held the property of Kells Monastery, including its lands in Breifne, was granted 475 acres of Cavan in the plantation. Tyrrell came from a Gaelicised Old English family in Westmeath and had been one of Hugh O'Neill's most able officers in the 9 Years' War, fighting in Leinster, Munster and at Kinsale. He changed sides at an opportune time and began buying land in Cavan, where he settled. And he served as a Justice of the Peace in 1607, when he broke into the property of Cairn MacPhilip and assaulted him, for which he was fined £20 in the Court of Castle Chamber, which was the Irish equivalent of the Court of Star Chamber, in 1611. Despite this, he was granted 2,000 acres in Tullygarby, Cavan. Talbot held lands at Ballyconnell jointly with the New English settler Hugh Culm, and both Talbot and Tyrrell were praised by the administration for their developments in Cavan. The administration under Lord Deputy Sir Arthur Chichester seized the opportunity presented by the power vacuum left by O'Neill and O'Donnell and their companions to confiscate their land and the estates of other Irish natives, including those who had been loyal to the Crown. This property was redistributed to English and Scottish servitors and undertakers who were to plant their lands with British settlers develop an anglicised Protestant society there, and create a new type of community and social hierarchy within the province, with the usual English systems of land and civic management and political participation, including parliaments. Cavan was one of the planted counties, and most of its land was transferred from local clans to new settlers. But 683 acres were also allocated for Cavan town, 917 for the establishment of a royal school to support local Protestant education, roughly 14,000 acres for the bishopric of Kilmore, and almost 2,000 for glebe lands for the church. Some natives retained at least part of their lands, and the de facto position of many of the current freeholders remained unchanged by the plantation. A smaller part of the land was allocated to loyal natives, including members of the once dominant O'Reilly clan and Fleming, Talbot and Tyrrell. To effect this radical change in Ulster, the Crown needed to pass the necessary legislation, including recognising James's title to the Irish Crown and O'Neill's attainder. Raising money by general taxation was also desired, and this could only be done through Parliament. The Crown proceeded with the plantation of Ulster, but the mechanisms necessary to create a permanent Protestant parliamentary majority were not neglected during its planning. Towns were an essential element of the plantation and of the development of a civilised society, and they dovetailed with James's Scottish attitudes and policy. Cavan town was incorporated in 1610 and Belturbet in 1613. Towns of various sizes and states of development and prosperity existed throughout Ireland and gradually acquired rights, initially usually to hold regular markets and fairs, and other privileges, generally by letters patent from the Crown. Eventually, some acquired royal charters, which granted more freedoms, including land for the town's development and commonage, and to provide a rental income for the corporation, a town council with municipal officers, town courts, and the ability to grant freedom to its inhabitants, which gave them rights of residence and trade and obligations to support the town through taxation and to defend it in emergencies. These privileges were frequently augmented by subsequent charters. Charters were usually the subject of lengthy negotiations between locals and the Crown, and privileges were granted in proportion to the town's present or anticipated development. The likely adverse effects of new privileges on existing towns was already taken into account. Many old towns, including Clonmel, Cork, Dingle, Fethard and Tipperary, Galway, Innisteague, Kilkenny, New Ross, Waterford and Wexford, received new charters between 1608 and 1612, partly as a quid pro quo for concessions to the Crown on income from custom charges and pontage, which was a tax on trade. The charter which Cavan's inhabitants negotiated established its corporation, with a chief magistrate, a sovereign, that's a lower rank than mayor, and 12 other councillors who were called burgesses, 2 portreeves, which in larger towns would be called bailiffs or sheriffs, the right to appoint a recorder, who was their legal officer, and a sergeant at mace, so that was a man who preceded the mayor on all occasions, carrying a silver mace as evidence of his authority, but also was sort of a gopher for the sovereign. He would do whatever was needed. Cavan's councillors were entitled to wear the same civic robes as those of Kells and Athboy, and were required to build a fólsal or a town hall for council meetings. The town encompassed all the land within 1 mile of Walter Brady's castle, except for Cavan Castle and 2 poles of land in Roscolgan. These provisions make it plain that the administration recognised that Cavan's economic development was either equal to those old established Meath towns, Kells and Athboy, or more probably had the potential to become so. Cavan was also given the right to send 2 burgesses to Parliament, 2 MPs. The first time this provision was included in any Irish charter ever. Athlone had received a charter in 1599 and a new one in 1606, and Gowran in Kilkenny, which had an earlier charter, received a new one in 1607, but neither of these mentioned parliamentary representation. 9 of Cavan's founding burgesses were of Gaelic origin: Walter, Thomas, George and Patrick Brady. Names were always anglicised in legal documents, so they may not have been called George, for example. Owen Moore, Owen Beag and Donogh O'Brogan, Turlough O'Dolly and Farrell Magrellis. 2 of the new burgesses were Old English, Philip Chute and again Walter Talbot, whom we've already met, and one was English, Hugh Cullen, and James Murray was presumably Scottish. Walter Brady had been appointed jailer of Cavan in 1584 and was a prosperous merchant, as was Thomas. They and Patrick Brady had jointly been granted 1,000 acres in the county in the plantation. An inquisition in Cavan town in 1607 included as jurors Fleming, Tyrrell, Talbot, and Thomas Patrick and Barnaby Brady, amongst others. Stephen Butler, the local planter from Bedfordshire, was Belturbert's first provost, so that's the equivalent of a portreeve, which is the lowest rank of urban officer under a mayor and a sovereign. 12 other founding burgesses were nominated by him, and all English Protestants. And the town was allocated 384 acres, so that's much less than Cavan, including commonage. Curiously, it had 2 sergeants of mace, which seems to be getting a bit above itself. No mention is made of a recorder, the legal officer, a town hall, or of civic robes. All the burgesses had English names, and Belturbet was also granted the right to parliamentary representation. Like other boroughs created after 1611, all the burgesses were to take the oath of supremacy, and all the councillors chose their own successors, filling vacancies from amongst the freemen. And this guaranteed perpetual Protestant membership, and as they were the only voters for the parliamentary elections, it would guarantee Protestant MPs. The title of the Chief Magistrate, sovereign or portreeve or equivalent, indicated that Cavan fell into the second rank of towns, between the large ones headed by mayors and the least prestigious managed by a portreeve or equivalent, and Belturbet into the third or bottom rank. As such, Cavan would act as the county town, and it already had a jail and public buildings suitable for holding courts and elections. These incorporations increased Cavan's parliamentary representation from the 2 county members in 1585 to 6 MPs in 1613. Parliaments were rare in Ireland, and only 3 met under Elizabeth, 1 under James, one in 1613 that we're about to talk about, and 2 under Charles. There were various reasons for this. One was finance. They were extremely expensive for the Crown, but also for local communities. Chichester was provided with £10,000 for the 1613 Parliament, but this is unlikely to have covered all the expenses. And another was the heavy administrative burden in fulfilling the provisions of Poynings law. I'll come to that in a moment. Parliamentary representation came at a price, especially for smaller constituencies, including pressure from the Crown and local power brokers to return their candidates, and the expense of MPs' salaries, which were paid by the counties and the town's inhabitants. Wages were costly, especially if Parliament sat for any length of time. Few men, no matter how civic-spirited, could afford to spend weeks away from their homes and businesses without their expenses being paid for travel, lodging, and for clothes, because MPs wore special gowns. County members were allowed 13 shillings and 4pence a day, and burgesses 6 shillings and 8pence a day for a 6-day week, or £4 for the county members and £2 for the townsmen every week, plus 10 days before and after each session to allow for travel. In 1613 to 15, this amounted to a total of £99, 6 shillings and 8pence for each Knight of the Shire county member, and £49, 13 shillings and 4pence for each burgess. So Cavan County would have had to raise almost £200, and Belturbet and Cavan Town almost £100 each to pay these salaries, an enormous amount for any town, but especially for ones that were small and had only recently been established. Had all Irish MPs been paid the statutory wages for this Parliament, the total cost would have been over £7,000 Irish, or £5,200 sterling. It's an enormous amount of money. While it was possible to come to local agreements for less than this statutory rate, the cost often induced smaller towns to return outsiders nominated by the Crown who would serve without pay. But county members were always paid the full rate. Secondly, Tudor parliaments had repeatedly provided the forum for conflict between the Crown and the Irish political community, led by men from the Pale. The experience had been difficult and at times utterly humiliating for successive Lords Deputy, Thomas Radcliffe, the Earl of Sussex, Henry Sidney, and Sir John Perrott, who had all expended substantial political capital for very little return. in each of Elizabeth's Irish parliaments. They had succeeded in arranging, generally, at least illegally, the return of government supporters, including Englishmen, to the Commons, but each had faced considerable and effective resistance to their legislative programmes from a highly organised Old English opposition, and the money raised by taxation was minimal and barely worth collecting. Chichester was anxious to avoid that experience by engineering a robust parliamentary majority and significant taxation. Thirdly, under Poyning's Law, which was passed in 1494, the Irish Parliament could only be summoned by permission from the King and Council in England after the Lord Deputy had written to them to certify the reasons for summoning it, which the King could, or Queen could still reject, and sent bills to the Irish Council for review and approbation. All bills introduced into the Irish Parliament had to be certified under the Great Seal of England, and they were painstakingly checked by English lawyers and often heavily amended or rejected. Of 14 bills considered by the English Council in one meeting before the 1613 Parliament, 7, 2 public bills and 5 private bills, were refused. 4 were allowed and 3 others were agreed, subject to checking some matters. So in other words, only about 50% of them got through. Poyning's Law gave the Crown control over the legislative programme, although it couldn't guarantee that bills would pass, but it created an enormous administrative burden for the Irish administration, and a significant one also for the English. Finally, in 1613, the Crown faced an apparently insuperable constitutional and political dilemma. While it could create counties at will and issue charters to towns as it pleased, parliamentary boroughs had the right to representation by tradition, not by charter. And the Crown, as in Scotland, had limited or no constitutional power to create them. The situation was different in England, where the Crown had the uncontested right to create boroughs, which it did very frequently. Very many, if not most, Irish towns had no right to be represented in Parliament, and those that had reflected the Norman settlement patterns and the history of limited Crown control over at least half of Ireland over many centuries. In 1585, Ulster and Connacht had only 2 boroughs each, Carrickfergus and Downpatrick, and there were some questions about Downpatrick, and Galway and Athenry, while Leinster and Munster had 21 and 11 boroughs respectively. Abiding by this centuries-old constitutional practice would have left the inhabitants of Ulster and Connacht with almost no representation other than their county members. This undercut the principle of Parliament as representing the whole country and undermined its moral and practical authority, by which MPs were given full power to conclude all business, and the entire community was bound by their decisions. Agreement by the whole political community was critical to success of the Crown's legislative programme and to granting and collecting taxes. New towns, which were intended to drive economic growth, could thrive without parliamentary representation, but the principle of popular consent would be fatally undermined if areas which had not previously been represented were not granted the right to send burgesses to Parliament. However, as Irish Catholics formed the great majority of the population, the Crown's attachment to the importance of political consent to the whole community was largely theoretical, as the administration had a negligible chance of parliamentary majority based on the current composition of county and borough seats. Furthermore, the Crown intended to pass a number of bills that would seriously disadvantage Catholics and the Old English gentry. Lawyers, and urban elites and the Catholic clergy were preparing their own electoral strategy to resist any legislation that would further undermine their position. The administration could have used 2 different precedents to justify the constitutional innovation of creating new parliamentary boroughs, but there's no record of their having been cited by the Crown. The first one was when Wales was incorporated into Westminster Parliament for the first time in the 1530s and 40s. And the second one was the creation of the towns of Marlborough and Philipstown in the new counties of Kings and Queens counties, where the land in the 1550s had been seized from their Gaelic owners and handed over to new English settlers, and county towns in Marlborough and Philipstown were created. Both of those towns had been incorporated in 1570, and they sat in the 1585 Parliament. But their charters made no mention of parliamentary representation. As I've said, Cavan was the first one. The Welsh constituencies provided a clear precedent, but their usefulness to an Irish administration determined to engineer a Protestant majority was limited by the fact that they each returned only one MP. The administration needed constituencies with 2 Protestant MPs to get a majority. Chichester, aided by his legal advisors, the Attorney General Sir John Davies, later MP, controversially, for Fermanagh, and Speaker of the Parliament, and the unpleasant Sir Robert Jacob, briefly MP for Carlow, actually all 3 were unpleasant, okay, decided to disregard the constitutional issue and unilaterally extend the royal powers to create parliamentary boroughs by charter, beginning with Cavan. James's agreement is implicit because in his granting the charters because they were all royal charters. As there was no recorded objection to this, possibly more because there was no obvious means of contesting it than because Cavan was an old Gaelic and largely Catholic settlement, they were able to repeat this precedent with impunity, despite considerable concern amongst Irish Catholics. They then incorporated 29 others, including Belturbet, plus Trinity College Dublin, between 1612 and the end of March 1613. This strategy was widely anticipated and caused disquiet and an immense sense of injustice. But the leaders of the Catholic opposition, while having no illusions about the Crown's motives or the certainty of its behaving unscrupulously, believed that they would still achieve a parliamentary majority. However, they seriously underestimated Chichester's deviousness and willingness to adopt unconstitutional means to achieve his end. The Ulster plantation was very recent and many intending settlers hadn't arrived and little construction had taken place by 1613. Planters were obliged to grant freeholds to their tenants in order to create an English social structure with a hierarchy, including sort of the middle class of freeholders. And because freeholders also formed the pool from whom jurors for courts and for inquisitions were chosen, but they also formed the county electorate. However, landlords were very reluctant to grant freeholds because leaseholding was much more profitable for them. As a result, while many Catholic freeholders had been disturbed by the plantation, at least 58 Catholic natives had been given grants which were freeholds, and many anticipated Protestant voters for the Catholic county seats had not yet arrived. Cavan town, or if they had arrived, had not been given freeholds. Cavan town remained overwhelmingly Catholic, and only Belturbet could be guaranteed to return Protestant MPs. Both the native Irish and the Crown were determined to win a majority in the Commons, and they used every tool at their disposal. Moreover, despite the administration's previous favour to and encouragement of Talbot, Tyrrell and the Bradys, they were now seen as disloyal subjects whose election must be prevented. This was the context within which both sides prepared for the Parliament, which was summoned on the 6th of March, 1613, to meet on the 18th of May. When nominating candidates, the administration usually chose at least one, if not 2, local men, and Chichester's hand is evidence in Cavan's aspirant MPs. The administration relied on privy councillors to manage its campaign throughout the country. Sir Oliver Lambert was given responsibility for Cavan, where he was one of the candidates for the county seat. He had been granted 2,000 acres in the county, but wasn't resident there and was mainly based at Kilbeggan, Westmeath, of which he was a founding burgess. He could easily have been returned for that borough, especially since he had arranged not to be its provost and returning officer. But he clearly preferred the greater prestige and the guaranteed salary of a county member in Cavan. Especially since his attempt, he was feeling rather frustrated because he had tried to use the opportunity of the Parliament to get himself ennobled, and having failed that, his consolation prize to himself was a seat for, as MP for County Cavan. The other Protestant county candidate was John Fish, who was a Bedfordshire settler who had been granted 2,000 acres in Lough Tee in Cavan. The official candidates for Belturbet were the energetic local settler, Sir Hugh Wirral, and the Dublin official, George Grindstish. And for Cavan, one of its founding burgesses, Hugh Cullen, and George Sexton, conforming to the standard pattern of one local and one external nominee for each borough. Wirral, who was one of a very large number of men knighted just before James's coronation in the Royal Garden at Whitehall, had been looking around for opportunities outside England. In 1609, with Thomas Ridgway, he had an involvement in the Virginia Company for exploration in North America. He arrived in Ireland in the following year when he was granted 1,000 acres in Cavan, although he also acquired property in Fermanagh and Monaghan. Within 12 months, he had built houses in Belturbet, where he had established 23 settlers. Grimesditch was a second-generation settler from Cheshire. He had inherited his father's office of customer of Dublin, and he married Margaret, the daughter of Sir John Tyrrell, formerly Mayor of Dublin. The Crown might have been eager to have him in the Commons, because they planned to introduce important bills about customs in the Parliament, and his expertise might have been helpful. Both of Cavan's candidates were closely connected to the Lord Deputy. Cullen was not merely a local planter and commander of the fort at Cloughoughter, who had served as Sheriff of Cavan in 1607, 1611 and 1612, but he was also a close relative of the Lord Deputy. He was presumably not selected as Sheriff in 1613 so that he would be eligible for election, as returning officers weren't legally able to return themselves. Sexton was a Limerick man, an Irish speaker, and an escheator an officer about lands in Ulster. But more importantly for this election, he was Chichester's secretary, and a man who held no property in Cavan, nor was he resident there as the law required. Cullen and Sexton together formed part of Chichester's funeral procession in Carrickfergus in 1625, so they were very close to him. The Catholic campaign was managed by Fleming, with Talbot and Tyrrell as the county candidates, and Cavan Town's first sovereign, Walter Brady, and his fellow merchant, Thomas Brady, for that borough. This marked a major change since 1585, both in the presence of the boroughs, but also because the county seats were not contested by O'Reillys or men from other Gaelic clans, but that the fight was between Old English Catholic settlers and New English Protestant ones. The county electorate was composed of freeholders whose land holding yielded £2 annually above all costs, the famous 40-shilling freeholders. Towns' electorates depended on their charter. Cavan's included all its male inhabitants, and Belturbet's only its 13 councillors. The sheriff was responsible for managing all returns in the county, conducting the county election himself, and sending mandates for election to the borough's chief officers, who were the returning officers, Cavan's sovereign and Belturbet's provost. The sheriff was also responsible for the correct conduct of elections and ensuring that no one breached the act that, quote, none of whatever degree soever he or they be of, shall disturb any free election by force or threats on great pains to be inflicted on the offender. Cavan had chosen Protestant sheriffs and dismissed from office many mayors who refused the oath of supremacy to ensure that as many returning officers as possible were Protestant. Chichester did not intend that they would be neutral. County elections were to be held between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning on the county day, the monthly shire court, after the receipt of the writs for election. The advantage of this arrangement was that the date and the location were well known in advance, and that many voters would be attending either as justices of the peace, jurors, or litigants. And that should have ensured a good attendance, but it also meant that elections took place over a 6 or 7 week period because each county had a different court date. Towns magistrates chose their own election day, which they were to publicise to the electorate, which was generally easy given the small size of most towns. Returning officers decided which candidate or candidates had the majority, and this was generally not done by counting individual votes, but based on a number of possibilities, including estimating the majority by the volume of shouting for each candidate, or dividing the voters into 2 groups to see which was the larger. He was not obliged to count votes, leaving considerable room for error, deliberate or otherwise. However, as the size of most electorates was small and the voters were generally well known to the returning officers, sheriffs kept records of the number of freeholders in the county to be able to assemble juries, and chief magistrates admitted freeholders, freemen to their towns, so they would have been familiar with them all. After the election, the sheriff prepared an indenture of return signed by the most important voters, a copy of which was sent to the Chancery in Dublin, and the other was kept by the community. Sheriffs could influence results by not publicising the date or place of election, or lying about them, refusing to allow voters into the venue, deliberately miscounting the number of votes, or by filing false indentures of return. Catholics allege that this was done very frequently in 1613. And all of these strategies were used in Cavan in 1613. Voters were excluded from elections in Armagh, Cavan and Roscommon, and votes were deliberately miscounted in Cavan Town, Dublin, Kildare and Trim, at the very least. Elections throughout Ireland were hotly contested, and both sides, acutely aware of what was at stake, were able to monitor the progress of results because they came in over this 6 or 7 week period. After elections, Catholics submitted a list of 14 constituencies, including both Cavan County and Cavan Town, in which they alleged serious electoral abuses. As all the new boroughs' electorates were Protestant, all of the allegations of abuse came from counties and old towns, including 5 Ulster counties and 1 town, Cavan. A royal commission was instituted to investigate the claims, and the Catholic schedule of abuses and the commission's reports provide the most detailed, if divergent and contradictory, accounts of the course of the elections. And I'm drawing on them for this account of Cavan's elections. Cavan Sheriff, Captain John Ridgway, a settler from Devon who had received 1,000 acres in the county, was the brother of the Privy Councillor Sir Thomas, later Earl of Londonderry, who had been granted extensive lands in Tyrone and took one of that county's seats with that sheriff's connivance. Thomas had represented Devon in the English Parliament between 1604 and 1606 and was a leader in the 1613 Irish Parliament, where he was one of relatively few with parliamentary experience, which he used to great and generally positive effect. The leader of the Catholic MPs, Sir John Everard, had described him at the end as having been, quote, a lantern and a light to this Parliament. Thomas's eldest son represented their town of Balnakill in Westmeath, where they generally lived, also a new borough. John Ridgway conducted the Cavan County election and oversaw Cavan Town and Belturbert's returns. Unsurprisingly, Belturbert's election on the 13th of April returned Wirral and Grimes, the other presumably serving without pay. However, elections for both the county seat and Cavan Town were conducted with fraud and aggression or violence. The increasing level of litigation in all parts of Ireland since the extension of the English common law to the whole county in 1605 meant that county days attracted a large number of freeholders as both jurors and litigants, and freeholders turned up in force at the Sessions House in Cavan on the 6th of April, both to attend the court and vote in the county election. The Sessions House was built in 1610 and may have served as the Tholsel or Guildhall, as public buildings often served several functions, especially as town hall, courthouse, market house, and the location of public meetings and entertainment. It may have been on the west side of the main street in the middle of the town, the site of the later courthouse. John Ridgway and the judges were already present, and the former told the freeholders that he had received the writ of election. Here the two accounts diverge. Protestants asserted that Fleming asked Ridgway to postpone the election, presumably to gather more freeholders, but he refused, and the Catholics walked out, claiming they would not be a party to his proceedings. They may have intended to put pressure on him by refusing to act as jurors and justices of the peace in the court. The Catholics claims that Ridgway told them to return on the following Monday, the 8th of April, for the poll. But despite this, the sheriff went into a corner of the courthouse, which would have been laid out as a courtroom with the judge's bench, seating for the jury, tables, and a bar behind which others had to stand, and attempted to hold the election with a small number of Protestant electors. The Catholics outside, realizing what was going on, entered the Sessions House and began to hold their own election in a different part of the building. Claiming that their candidates had the greater number of voices, they asked the sheriff to draw up the indenture of return for Talbot and Tyrrell, but he refused and returned Fish and Lambert. Unfortunately, neither account provided any figures of voters or votes cast, but the fact that they could all fit in a crowded Sessions House full of furniture demonstrates that the numbers were small, although based on plantation grants to Irishmen, the Catholics could have anticipated at least 58 votes and more if they'd created other freeholders. Ridgway would certainly have held the election at once had there been a majority of Protestant voters, so Catholic claims of a fraudulent election seem well-founded. Unpleasant, probably both unjust and illegal as this return was, at least it was peaceful. unlike that for Cavan Town, which involved intimidation and aggression, if not violence, but also some unlawful and preemptive behaviour by the Catholic inhabitants. In all, there were at least 4 attempts at an election for Cavan Town. Very soon after the issuing of election writs in late March, Cavan's inhabitants gathered on the 1st of April, a day before the earliest election in the campaign, which was Clare County, without waiting for the sheriff's mandate, and they elected Walter and Thomas Brady. This may have been due either to ignorance of the procedure or, more probably, an attempt to preempt pressure to return Protestants. Towards the end of April, Hugh Cullen brought the sheriff's mandate to the town and ordered the sovereign, Portreeves and townsmen to gather together, and he nominated himself and Sexton to be the town's MPs. The townsmen refused to elect them, presumably citing their earlier poll. On the 2nd of May, Lambert and the sovereign once again summoned the townsmen to an election. The day was deliberately chosen as a Sunday when Catholics would be attending Mass. While the small number of Protestant electors were gathering together, Lambert imprisoned Walter Brady and threatened him with the loss of his castle, and positioned soldiers at session doors with their guns primed, refusing entry to anyone they thought would vote for the Bradys, and admitting only their own supporters, including some who were ineligible to vote. Catholics, presumably returning from Mass, found that the election was being held and went to the Sessions House, where the soldiers blocked their entry. One town councillor, Philip Jude, hearing them shouting outside, demanded that they be admitted, but the soldiers drew their guns to keep them out. Another councillor, George Brady, challenged Moelmurra O'Reilly for voting, as he didn't live in the town. And when George refused Lambert's demand that he vote for Cullen and Sexton, Oliver attacked him with a truncheon. Despite the Brady's clear majority, Ridgway and the sovereign made off an indenture of return for Cullen and Sexton, which the townsmen refused to endorse. Lambert summoned George Brady to his lodgings to intimidate him into signing the indenture, and when he refused, Cullen had to intervene to prevent Lambert stabbing George. Lambert relieved his spleen by imprisoning George and threatening the other townsmen that, quote, all their lives rested in his hands. Even the biased commission admitted that Lambert assaulted George, quote, with a small walking stick, but excused his behaviour, claiming that Brady had used, quote, some rude behaviour and giving him some unfitting speeches, but his head wasn't broken. Cullen was considerably less aggressive than Lambert, possibly because he lived in Cavan and shared lands with Talbot. A 4th poll on the following day elected Walter Brady only, possibly an attempt to reach a local compromise of 1 Catholic, 1 Protestant, but the sheriff forwarded the fraudulent indenture of the 2nd of May to the Chancery, naming Cullen and Sexton as Cavan's burgesses. It is not clear from the rival accounts whether the unidentified sovereign was happy to rig the election or yielded to Lambert's intimidation, but permitting Moelmurra O'Reilly to vote, tolerating Lambert's interference, and producing a fraudulent indenture of return were all illegal acts. The conduct of the elections, the sheriff's duplicity, and the injustice and dishonesty of the returns, along with Lambert's violent and intimidatory behaviour, incensed the local Cavan population, especially because it followed the confiscation of much of their estates and their replacement in crown and civic offices by newcomers who treated them with contempt. Nor were they on their own. Quite apart from the constitutional issue of whether the Crown had the right to create parliamentary boroughs, the conduct of many elections was illegal, breaching several laws, including the requirement that MPs be resident in their constituencies and that there should be no interference in free elections. Despite similar thuggish conduct by Privy Councillors in other counties and towns, Chichester failed to achieve a parliamentary majority. While he let it be known that 30 boroughs would be created, instead, as he reported to London on the 14th of April, he had secretly held back charters for 9 further towns, which he covertly issued, and he arranged for their returns using blanks immediately before Parliament met, ensuring the return of Robert Jacob and others who had presumably been rejected for other seats. The Catholics who had secured a majority, despite the administration's intimidatory, fraudulent, and illegal electioneering, only discovered the existence of the additional 18 Protestant members when Parliament met, and they objected vigorously. the matter came to a head over the election of John Davies, whom the Catholics alleged was fraudulently returned from Fermanagh as Speaker, nominated by Thomas Ridgway, and the Catholics seceded, declaring, quote, "Those within your house are no house, and your Speaker, no Speaker of the House, but we are the House. And therefore we will not join with you, but we will complain to my Lord Deputy and to the King, and the King shall hear of this." They refused to return and appealed to the King, attaching this list of electoral abuses in 14 named cases, including Cavan County and Town. James's commission investigated all the cases and reported misreturns in Cavan and Kildare towns, leading the King to declare that the 9 additional boroughs should not sit in this Parliament. The question was left open for future Parliaments. Parliament resumed on the 11th of October 1614, accepting James's ruling but reserving any future decision of which boroughs were to be represented in any future Parliament. The Commission wasn't intended to be an impartial body, and it is highly probable that many of the other allegations of electoral abuse and fraud were also correct, including Cavan County. The law provided heavy penalties for sheriffs who misreturned candidates, but it's unclear whether Cavan inhabitants, especially the Bradys, took legal action against John Ridgway, Lambert, or Cavan's sovereign, although Cavan's elites were not slow to use English law when it suited them. At the very least, Culm and Sexton were unseated, and a second, or indeed fifth, depending how you count, election took place on the 27th of October 1614, in which Thomas and Walter Brady were duly elected and took their places in the House of Commons, which was in Dublin Castle. However, local tensions persisted, and on the 8th of November 1614, Walter raised the issue that despite an order for restitution from the justices of the assizes, the local court, the sheriff, by now John Butler, was still detaining goods which had been seized from him. This breached parliamentary privilege, which protected MPs and their servants, goods and persons, and Butler was ordered to appear in Parliament on the 28th of November to explain himself. Cavan's members did not shine in their contributions to the House. As a Privy Councillor, Lambert took a prominent part in House's business. Fish sat on several committees, but his indiscreet and offensive remark about members of the House of Lords led to his imprisonment and a censure from the Commons. Unabashed, he was back contributing to the House on the 23rd of November. Grimesditch also sat on 2 committees on bills and used parliamentary privilege to object to being served with a subpoena out of the Court of Exchequer. The Bradys are recorded as sitting on no committees and making no contributions to the House's work, other than Walter's use of this parliamentary privilege to have his goods restored. Lambert was quick to get his version of the election out to justify their actions. Edmund Scarry, very briefly MP for Oher, one of the 9 boroughs covertly incorporated by Chichester, wrote a document entitled A Survey of the Present Estate of Ireland Anno 1615 for the King, a copy of which is in the papers of his relative by marriage, Lord Ellesmere, Chancellor of England, in the Huntingdon Library in Los Angeles. In this, Scorry discussed Cavan's county election as evidence of the irredeemably untrustworthy and subversive nature of the Irish. And I quote, "In this last Parliament, called in Anno 1613, to cause a combination both in the towns and countries, in other words, counties, and to overthrow your Majesty's most pious and princely purpose of the Parliament, by choosing the most infamous men in every town and country for their knights and burgesses, in matter of conformity, either in religion or other civil disobedience. And I am assumed that Nugent the Jesuit was sent into all of the north, and by this your Majesty may suppose others were designated to other places, to warn the towns and counties that they admit none to be of the Parliament House that were English, and did in particular nominate," and he uses these names in capitals for emphasis, "Talbot and Tyrrell for the county of Cavan. Talbot is well known to your Majesty, and for Tyrrell it is he that, having a company of soldiers bestowed upon him by the late Queen, did openly run away to Tyrone and proved little less dangerous than Tyrone. Yet afterwards he got a pension from the state of £10 per day, and did keep it till of late, besides very large favour in the distribution of the northern land," otherwise the plantation of Ulster, "and is booked for one of the servitors, so that if some men have been rewarded for the evil they have done, or for the evil they may be feared to do, how much more may your Majesty in your princely wisdom and goodness reward those who have spent their time and monies in enabling of themselves to do your service, and in the doing thereof are so faithful, diligent, and intentive to your Majesty's good, which was presumably a reference to loyal subjects like Lambert. The bitterness of the election campaign did not dissipate after Parliament ended, but the treatment of those involved in the elections was determined by their religion. Most of the Protestants were awarded marks of official favour after Parliament, but the Catholic MPs and candidates were not. Grimesditch and John Ridgway died before they had opportunity to benefit. They both died in 1616. Sexton was knighted in 1616 and finally achieved a Cavan connection when he married Fish's daughter Anne. Despite Fish's poor behaviour in the Commons, he was made Sheriff of Cavan in 1616 and created a baronet in 1622. In a calculated insult, Lambert chose the title Baron Lambert of Cavan when he was ennobled in February 1618, 3 months before he died. Cumann served as sheriff again in 1618, was knighted in 1623 and died in 1630. Wirral continued to hold his lands in Cavan and his wife was a resident there in 1622, but Hugh was at that time in England. His activities between that date and 1643, when he was buried in Croydon, remain obscure. Stephen Butler, who arranged Belturbert's returns, was knighted in 1616, it was a good year for knights, and appointed sheriff in 1622. He was MP for Cavan County in 1634 and died in 1638. The Catholics received no mark of favour. None was knighted or served as sheriff. Despite Walter and Thomas Brady's elections, the Clerk of the Commons, Edmund Medoc, certified that they and Kildare's Catholic burgesses were only due £14, 13 shillings and 4pence each for wages, an attendance rate of only 42 days, whereas Lambert and Fish were paid for the full 149 days. Medoc certified full wages for almost all MPs, although not those for Belturbet, which is curious, but the Brady's and Kildare's burgesses were not fined for non-attendance in Parliament, so Medoc's failure to certify their complete entitlement to wages looks both discriminatory and illegal. Fleming died in 1615 and was succeeded by his 26-year-old son Thomas, who was already married to Ellen Netterville, whose father Nicholas would be created Viscount Netterville in 1622. Both Talbot and Thomas Fleming were convicted in August 1617 in the Court of Castle Chamber of refusing to present Catholics when members of the Cavan jury, and they were fined £60 each. It was a huge amount of money. Talbot remained on his land at Ballyconnell, and the 1622 Commission noted that all his tenants were Catholic. Despite this, he acted as security for the Protestant Leal as Sheriff of Cavan in 1622. He died in 1625 and was succeeded by his 10-year-old son, James. James later married Helen Calvert, daughter of the First Lord Baltimore, at St. Martin in the Fields in London in 1637 with a dowry of £1,200. Cavan's parliamentary elections show the willingness of Chichester's administration to use any fraudulent, illegal and violent means to engineer a majority in James's only Irish Parliament. The subversion of normal processes, the intimidation of local magistrates and voters, the use of soldiers to prevent voters participating at ballots, and the willingness to kidnap and imprison a Catholic candidate show the lengths to which some Crown officials were willing to go to achieve their ends. However, the determined resistance of its native population in Cavan and throughout Ireland gained a moral and political victory, albeit at a personal cost to the Catholics, who saw their opponents prosper while they came under increasing political, social, and economic pressures because of their religion. This was the last Irish Parliament before James II's Patriot Parliament to have an effective Irish opposition led by Catholics. Charles's parliaments would see only one Catholic MP elected for Cavan County in both 1634 and 1640, and none for the town or Belturbet. The 1613 elections marked a watershed in Irish parliamentary history in Cavan and throughout Ireland. Thank you.